It was an unseasonably warm January day in Boston, the air thick with the promise of spring. Children chased each other through the North End's cobblestone streets, their laughter echoing through the close-knit Italian neighborhood. The year was 1919, and a world weary from war clung to the hope of a brighter future. Yet unbeknownst to the unsuspecting city, a shadow was about to fall, a sticky, suffocating shadow that would forever stain the streets crimson. The source of this impending disaster stood silently on Commercial Street, a colossal steel tank, 50 feet tall and filled to the brim with 2.3 million gallons of molasses. This viscous behemoth, owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, was a familiar sight to the residents of the North End. But on this day, it would transform into a monstrous harbinger of destruction. Its sweet cargo soon to be unleashed in a torrent of chaos. The air, heavy with the unusual warmth, carried a faint, sickly, sweet aroma. Few paid it any mind, dismissing it as a quirk of the unusual weather or perhaps the byproduct of some nearby bakery. The tank, it seemed, had a life of its own, expanding and contracting with the changing temperatures. The giant molasses tank, a monument to industrial ambition, stood as a silent sentinel at 529 Commercial Street. Its presence dominated the landscape, casting an imposing shadow over the surrounding tenements and businesses. Erected just 3 years prior in 1916, the tank was a vital cog in the machinery of American industry. Its purpose to store vast quantities of molasses, the sweet byproduct of sugar refining, destined for fermentation into industrial alcohol. This thick, viscous liquid shipped from the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean arrived in Boston aboard ships. The molasses would then be pumped into the gargantuan tank, awaiting its transformation into a vital ingredient for munitions production. However, the construction of this behemoth had been rushed, plagued by cost-cutting measures and a disregard for safety protocols. Rumors circulated among the North End residents of shoddy workmanship, of leaks patched hastily with cheap materials. The molasses, sensitive to fluctuations in temperature, expanded within the confines of the poorly constructed tank. Unbeknownst to the people going about their day, the behemoth on Commercial Street was on the verge of bursting. The year 1919 was a time of great unrest and uncertainty. The shadow of the Great War loomed large, its devastating effects still felt across the globe. The Spanish flu pandemic had ravaged communities, leaving behind a trail of grief and fear. And in the United States, the burgeoning labor movement clashed with industrialists, creating a climate of social and economic tension. Against this backdrop of global upheaval, the city of Boston faced its own set of challenges. The influx of immigrants seeking a better life on American shores brought about rapid demographic shifts. The North End, in particular, was a melting pot of cultures, its narrow streets teeming with life, a blend of hope and hardship. The molasses tank, a symbol of industrial progress, stood in stark contrast to the poverty and struggle that characterized much of the neighborhood. The unusual warmth on that January day only added to the sense of unease that permeated the city. The air, thick and heavy, seemed to amplify the anxieties of the time. Whispers of labor strikes and social unrest filled the air, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and dread. Little did the residents of Boston know that a more immediate and far stranger threat loomed large in their midst. The molasses tank, a silent giant harboring a deadly secret, was about to unleash a wave of destruction unlike anything the city had ever seen. January 15, 1919 dawned like any other winter day in Boston. The city stirred to life, its inhabitants unaware of the impending disaster. On Commercial Street, workers at the Purity Distilling Company, located adjacent to the molasses tank, began their day. The air, unusually warm for January, carried a cloying sweetness, a harbinger of the horror to come. At 12:40 p.m., A deep rumble shook the ground like a subway train roaring beneath the cobblestones. The colossal molasses tank, its rivets groaning under immense pressure, had reached its breaking point. With a deafening roar, the steel behemoth buckled, unleashing a torrent of molasses in a catastrophic wave. The viscous flood, traveling at an estimated 35 miles per hour, surged through the streets with the force of a tsunami. Buildings crumbled under its immense weight, their foundations no match for the sticky deluge. The air filled with a deafening cacophony of collapsing structures, the shrieks of terrified horses, and the desperate cries of those caught in the path of the onrushing wave. The molasses, thick and relentless, swallowed everything in its path. The wave of molasses, a surging river of sweet despair, tore through the heart of the North End, leaving a path of destruction in its wake. Buildings crumbled and collapsed, their foundations no match for the sheer weight and force of the deluge. The air, thick with the deafening roar of the collapse and the cries of the injured and dying, was heavy with the cloying sweetness of molasses. The Boston Elevated Railway's Atlantic Avenue structure, an elevated train platform, swayed precariously as the wave of molasses slammed into its supports. The structure groaned under the impact, its steel beams twisting, but miraculously it held. Had it collapsed, the death toll would have been even more catastrophic. But even as the structure stood defiant, the scene below was one of utter devastation. Those who could ran for their lives, their feet slipping and sliding in the sticky morass. Mothers clutched their children, desperate to escape the relentless surge. The molasses, thick and unforgiving, trapped its victims, encasing them in its sticky embrace. The molasses, initially a wave of destruction, settled into a stagnant sea of sticky goo, trapping its victims in its relentless grip. Men, women, and children struggled against the suffocating tide, their cries for help muffled by the thick, viscous fluid. The air, heavy with the stench of molasses and the growing panic, became thick and difficult to breathe. Anthony DeStasio, a 10-year-old boy playing with his friends, found himself swept away by the torrent. Tossed and tumbled like a rag doll, he lost consciousness, waking up later in the wreckage of a building, his body encased in the suffocating molasses. Miraculously, he was found by rescuers, his cries for help finally heard above the din of the disaster. Teresa Iobi, a young mother, was walking home with her 2 daughters when the wave struck. Separated from her children in the chaos, she clung desperately to a lamppost, her body battered by debris, her heart filled with terror. As the initial shock subsided, a desperate rescue effort commenced. Word of the disaster spread like wildfire, drawing rescuers and volunteers to the scene. Doctors and nurses, their white coats soon stained crimson with molasses and blood, worked tirelessly to tend to the injured. Police officers, firefighters, and sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket rushed to the scene, their efforts hampered by the thick, sticky molasses that clung to everything it touched. The rescuers faced a grim and daunting task. The molasses, now beginning to harden in the cold January air, made movement treacherous. Every step was a struggle, every movement hampered by the sticky goo. The air, thick with the stench of molasses and the cries of the injured, was difficult to breathe. The rescuers, their faces grim with determination, used shovels, axes, and even their bare hands to dig through the wreckage, searching for survivors trapped beneath the debris. The injured, many covered head to toe in molasses, were carried to makeshift hospitals set up in nearby buildings. In the wake of the Great Molasses Flood, the North End resembled a war-torn battlefield. The once bustling neighborhood lay in ruins, its streets and buildings coated in a thick layer of molasses. The air, heavy with the stench of the disaster, hung thick and silent. The only sounds the mournful cries of rescuers and the heartbroken sobs of those who had lost loved ones. The official death toll stood at 21, but many more were never accounted for, their bodies lost in the sticky morass. Over 150 were injured, some with injuries so severe they would endure a lifetime of pain and disability. The physical damage was estimated at over $100 million in today's currency. But the true cost of the disaster extended far beyond the quantifiable. The Great Molasses Flood left an indelible scar on the psyche of Boston. It was a stark reminder of the destructive power of industrial negligence, a testament to the fragility of life in the face of such unexpected catastrophe. The disaster also exposed the deep social and economic divisions within the city.